Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the Dataset Explorer and probably get started with the query runner or the SQL runner. So if I take a look at the Dataset Explorer, again, I have the built-in Dremio catalog. And just so you know, generally for your first project, when you first sign up for a new Dremio account, the storage for this catalog is managed by Dremio. Okay, so in that case, we're managing the storage, and the usage of that storage does consume DCUs. Now, this is a great solution if you don't have any pre-existing cloud storage, and would just like have us kind of manage all that for you. Now, if you're a company with an existing data lake and would prefer to store all your iceberg tables on your data lake, what you would do is you would, once you've kind of decided that you wanted to go with Dremio, you would upgrade. So once you actually have a credit card on file, you'll be able to create additional projects, and in additional projects, you can then determine that the default storage is your data lake. And then you would just pass in the configurations for your data lake, and that catalog would then store any tables in the catalog would be stored in your data lake versus in Dremio's managed storage. So you can use your data lake. And again, you can also use other iceberg catalogs with whatever storage those catalogs support with Dremio. Dremio is able to communicate with pretty much any storage anywhere. Okay, but I have several example SQL statements to kind of start seeding some data into this catalog. So you can actually see Dremio or write some iceberg tables to your catalog. But again, also keep in mind that if you have existing data sources, feel free to connect them. So if you already have an AWS Glue catalog with a bunch of iceberg tables in it, or any of these other catalogs, or you have some Parquet and CSV datasets and object storage, or some other tables and databases, and you want to query them through Dremio, go ahead, do connect them. One of the best things about Dremio is that you don't have to move your data to Iceberg to get the advantage of the lakehouse right up front. You can connect your data where it is now, make use of Dremio where your data is now, and then incrementally migrate to Iceberg to unlock the full benefits of Dremio. So that's sort of what you see here. So again, I can either add more namespaces that's within the catalog, or I can add more sources. These are external to the project. So these are databases, external catalogs, data warehouses, and where you're pulling in the data from there, etc. Okay, so always remember, there's two places where my data can be. It can either be in the project catalog for that project, or in some sort of external source. Now, if I have other projects where I want to use tables from another project, I can then hit plus source, and then you'll see here, there's this open catalog source. So this one with the Dremio logo will allow you to connect that catalog from other projects into other projects. So everything can talk to each other if you wanted to. Okay, so now let's go to the SQL runner. Now this Git repo with all these SQL statements, I'm going to give you the link in the video description. So you'll have the video description there. But actually, all of these SQL statements actually assume that you already have a namespace by the name of Dremio. So we're going to go add our first namespace. We're just going to call it Dremio, lowercase Dremio. Now again, you might want to call it differently. You might want to have it like a namespace per department, or per like data product, or for however you decide you want to organize your data. But in this case, I'm creating a namespace named Dremio. This is just going to be where I'm going to run all these sample queries in. Cool. So now we're going to go over here. And there's a whole bunch of them. Most of them are just basically the same deal, where they're going to create some basic tables with a few records as your bronze or raw layer, then create a silver layer where we join that data, and then a gold layer where we create like use case specific stuff. So I'm just going to start off with the finance example right now. So if I can click on this, I can then literally just copy the SQL without having to change anything, and it should just work as long as we have that Dremio namespace, because that's the assumption. So I can just go in here and paste that SQL. Now, whenever you actually build SQL here in the SQL editor, just keep in mind that you get a lot of really cool quality of life features like autocomplete, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. But first, I'm going to just run this. So if I can click here and click run to run that SQL. So I'll just put my cursor right there and hit run. And now notice that while I'm running many different SQL statements, here in the results tab, each query gets its own results tab. So that way I can see the query results for the specific queries I want to look at. So I could have a script with like 10 different SQL queries, and then each of those results will be nice and parsed out, making it easy for me to actually see what happens afterwards. And I have this nice summary screen which shows me all the different queries that are in that script, how long it took to run each one, what's the job ID, so that way I could look that up later here if I need to do any troubleshooting. So all there. So almost done. It's running like the last query now. Okay, good. Okay, so that has all run successfully. Okay, now notice what happens when I click on these tabs. It'll highlight the query that's being run. So in that case, if I'm wondering, hey, what is this a result for? Well, it's going to highlight exactly what that is a result for. Just makes it sort of, again, nice quality of life different features. And again, a lot of this UI is really meant for like business units who are like self-serving data. So imagine giving sort of frontline business analysts who have some familiarity with SQL the ability to kind of use this. And even if they don't know SQL, Dremio has like a lot of little wizards to help you do a lot of things with data, even if you don't know SQL. And I'll show you that more in a moment. Okay, but we ran that. So now if I go back to my Dataset Explorer, I should see that those data sets exist here now. So I go to Dremio. I see, look, now there's the finance data set. And I see the raw, silver, gold. Cool. Okay, I can see those data sets exist. Now notice that these data sets are purple. Whenever you see a purple data set, that is a physical data set, meaning that's the actual physical table. Okay, either a physical iceberg table if we're talking about an iceberg catalog, or if we're talking about like a database or data warehouse, it's a table in that database or data warehouse. Now, if I go to the silver layer, the way these queries worked, actually, let me go to the silver layer. Notice this one is like a green, right? Like it's like a turquoise green color. These are virtual data sets, meaning it's a SQL view. Okay, so in this case, this is not a physical table. There's no Parquet file. There's no additional Parquet files. Like this particular object here, which I can query. So look, I can just run a query on this view. Okay, and it's going to give me results. Wonderful. But technically, if I were to go under the hood, like if I click over here where it says open details, I can click on data to see what this actually is. So really under the hood of that view, it's this SQL being run. Okay, technically it's running off those tables that we saw in the raw layer. Okay, so we're not creating another physical set of Parquet files. It's just it's just essentially a pre-written SQL statement that we're treating as its own object. Okay, and then cool stuff you can see here when you're here in this like sort of details panel, I can see this data section of the data set that tells me, hey, this is the SQL of the view if it's a view. Then I can go to the details panel. This is where you can actually find, like, this is where you start seeing like data being curated for like the semantic layer. So every data set has its listing of sort of like, hey, it's columns, it's schema. You have this basic data set overview. So like sort of like, hey, what is a SQL dialect? When was it last updated? Who is the owner? And when was this data set created? Is there any descendants? This has to do with like lineage. Like, hey, was there any views created from this thing? Okay, and how many jobs in the last 30 days were on this data set? Now I can tag this data set to make it easier to find. So in this case, this is a silver data set. I might tag it silver. Okay, so that way it's easier for me to find this silver data set. And then there's a wiki where you can write markdown. Okay, a documentation, and you can write documentation. Now again, all of this put together is part of Dremio's semantic layer. So when Dremio's MCP server is actually interacting with Dremio, it's actually going to be pulling in all this detailed data that you can use to help better understand data sets. That's going to give you better natural language analytics than if you didn't have this semantic information. Now again, having to come up with what your tags are going to be and what your wiki is going to be can be work. So we do have a way to automate that, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. But since I'm here, I also want to point out there's this lineage view. Okay, now this lineage view will update whenever your catalog's metadata updates. Okay, so right now by default, okay, if I go to my settings, my project settings, okay, I can go to the catalog settings, and I can see that the metadata refresh by default is once every hour. Now, however the changes to minute, we'll see that in a minute from now, that lineage will be all fleshed out. So I'll come back to that. But since I'm here in settings, I also want to show you that here in preferences, there's one feature that's not automatically on. That's the ability to generate wikis and labels. So I can turn that on. Yep, just turn it back off. Turn it on. And you can see there's other features here that can be turned on and off depending on what you want to make available to your users, such as SQL autocomplete, the ability to download results. So you can actually download results as like a Parquet file or a CSV file. Query dataset on click, so you just click on it and it runs SQL. Autonomous reflections is where we're going to accelerate your data automatically. So technically right now that's automatically on. Behind the scenes, Dremio is going to be figuring out once a day, based on your query patterns, how this basically, what kind of things that needs to materialize behind the scenes to speed things up, and what previous materializations could be deleted because you're not querying those patterns anymore. So in this case, a lot of the work that you would have to be doing day in and day out, managing things like materialized views and cubes, is no longer needed because Dremio will do that for you for specifically your iceberg tables in any catalog. Okay, so autonomous reflections work for any iceberg table in any catalog. Cool. So now that we've turned that on, I'm going to go back to that silver data set. So Dremio, finance, silver, trades enriched. And again, I can click on this open details panel to see the details. So now if I click here, see, like if we see the tags, I see this little button here now. Whenever you see this little button, that means AI in Dremio. So now I can click this to generate a table, like basically, and see it says, okay, here's some tags that it suggests. So I will append. So it'll add these tags to the existing tags that I've already added. Okay, and then here in the wiki, I can go edit the wiki. Okay, actually, I think I need to empty it out first. We go to a fresh data set. Finance, cold, P&L by account symbol, open details. And then you can see here it says generate wiki. So I can click generate wiki, and then it's going to use the AI to generate the wiki entry. So you see here, like, it just gives you some basic data. So it shows you, like, takes an example row. It kind of tries to infer what the role of this data set is, the schema, and now that's available for like the next person to kind of have an idea. And again, I can also then generate those tags. In this case, none were for this particular one didn't generate any tags, but we have that there. Okay, and again, we have lineage view, which again, when the next metadata refresh happens, that will populate. And then we have reflections. Reflections are sort of like, if you, like I mentioned earlier, that you can autonomously manage performance, where Dremio will just kind of handle it for you. But sometimes you may want to go in there and kind of do that sort of materialized view, BI cube type thing for yourself. There's data sets you want to accelerate. Well, that's what these are. So essentially, raw reflections are going to be like materialized views. So if you wanted to turn that on a view, you would just click that, and Dremio would manage the rest. And you would click save. And then if you wanted like something more like similar to a BI cube to speed up like a BI dashboard, you would click an aggregate reflection, specify, hey, what dimensions and measures you want to accelerate, and then click save. Okay. Now, if you do create a reflection, okay, so let's actually create a reflection real quick so you can just see it in action. So I click save. Okay, what it's going to do, it's going to then materialize this thing. So in this case, what it's doing now is instead of this particular gold view being a virtual data set, it's actually making a physical copy behind the scenes that it can substitute during queries. But the cool thing is, like, what usually happens with like materialized views in other platforms is that people make a lot of materialized views that don't get used, and then you're paying for all the storage, and no one ever knows if they can get rid of the materialized views because no one knows if they're being used. Well, if you do create these reflections yourself, in your project settings, there is a reflection section. And you can see the reflections that you've created, and they will have a score, and that score will be between 0 and 100 to tell you sort of like how useful this is, like how often is this being used, what value is it providing you. The closer it is to 100, the more valuable the reflection is. The closer to 0 is, the more like maybe you should just delete it. Okay, then you can just click here and just delete the reflection, which I'll do right now. But again, here I can monitor all my manually created reflections. Okay, I can see what type of reflection is. I can see what the score of it is, its current footprint, when it was last refreshed. I can see all this kind of useful information. Scroll so you can see the last bit of it. And then here I can see how many queries has it accelerated, so forth. Okay, and again, I'm just going to get rid of this reflection, so all I have to do is just zap it like that. Cool. Okay. I've covered a little bit more than I wanted to cover in this video, but I'm going to show you two more things. If I were to just get a fresh tab, let's say I just wanted to kind of create my own, create a table real quick. So let's say create. So you notice here I have this autocomplete here. Okay, create table. Okay. In this case, I want to create it in this Dremio namespace. So I'm going to put that right there, Dremio. Now, if it was like longer, like that'd be fine, but we're going to just call it Dremio.test. I'll give it a schema of, a name, which is going to be a varchar. And then I'm going to insert into the table to Dremio.test values Alex Merced. And then just to confirm that it was created, let's just do a select star from Dremio.test. Okay. In this case, you saw the autocomplete in action. Okay, and you saw the syntax highlighting in action where, when things were partially completed, you saw like the red squiggly lines telling me that I had typos or syntax errors. So you have all these things that we usually make life a lot easier when editing code. Okay, and I can see that all these queries were successful, so we created our table. So just to double check, I go back here in Dremio, I see our test table is right there. Okay, now the SQL that I wrote here, let's say I wanted to use this as like a template for later, I could save this as like a script. So I can just click here, save it as a script, and then it becomes visible here under scripts. The other thing I can do is I can save it as a view. So in this case, if I were to come up with my own custom SQL that I would like to save as a view, I could click save this, if it's like a single SQL statement. I want to save this the results of this data as a view in my catalog. I can just click save as view here. In this case, that can't because it's multiple SQL statements. But let's say if I did something like this, select star from Dremio.test, limit 1. There's only one record in there. If I were to, basically save that as a view, it'll ask me where I want to save that view in my catalog. All views will get stored in your Dremio catalog for that project. Okay, and I can choose where I want it. I can go create additional folders and then save it in there. So you've seen both ways you can create views now, because early when we ran the SQL, I used SQL to create a view, but you notice I can also use the UI to create a view. Okay, and then also in the UI, we see here we have a functions lookup, the ability to turn off autocomplete, take a look at our shortcuts, okay, and then we have this context window. So you notice how I'm writing like Dremio test here? What if I don't want to have to write Dremio test every time? I can go in here and choose the context of my query. So I'm saying, hey, the context here is Dremio, meaning assume that I'm in the Dremio folder, so I don't have to write Dremio anymore. I can just write test. It's going to assume Dremio.test because I set the context to Dremio. So for certain queries, this can be a nice, convenient thing. Okay, to save you from having to write a bunch of namespaces. But that's not the only choice I have. I can also go over here, and let's say, again, I wanted to get this, let's say, this finances gold data set. I could just drag it and drop into there, and there the whole name of the table gets copied in there, make it much easier for me to write out like long table names, because I can just drag them over here from the side. So hopefully that gives you a nice tutorial far as like the Dataset Explorer and running SQL in Dremio.